know, we have spent a lot of time at past Twin events and even at this Twin event talking about education and the fact that because of everything going on in the world, we need to question how education takes place. You are about to hear from someone who has some great ideas about how he thinks that should be done. Conrad Wolfram is a physicist, mathematician, technologist, strategic director, and European co-founder, CEO of Wolfram, the computational company behind Mathematica, Wolfram Language, and Wolfram Alpha, which, by the way, if you ever ask Siri a quantitative question, his company is behind how Siri figures that out. Conrad is a leading advocate for the fundamental shift in how we should teach math in school. So let's hear from him, and we'll figure out, we'll have some time afterwards to ask some questions and see how the audience feels. Conrad.
Thank you very much. So I've entitled this Fixing Education for the AI Age, Humans Don't Lose Out. That's the danger. How are we as humans going to make sure we optimize what we do given the rise of artificial intelligence and computing power? So a key question that's going to dominate, I think, for the next few years is, what is it that the human does and what is it the computer does? And can we reset the curricula, the subject matter that we're teaching students for an optimized human-computer setup? That's really what we want to be driving at. And a good question to ask at the start of this is, what are today's survival skills? You know, a few thousand years ago, they were learning to light fires and make sure animals didn't eat you. Most places in the world, that's not a problem, even in the UK. The question is, what are those skills now? And what will they be coming up? Literacy, I would say, is one of those skills now. What about data literacy? Next question, let's look at the other extreme. What's tomorrow's value-added skills? What's really critical? What's going to be the thing that really adds economic value to the future? And that's another part of the question we really need to worry about. So my day job, as was briefly described, is really to build the best computation and AI tech. So I'm trying to push the boundaries of what computation does. And I think this is part of the answer and what I want to talk about today. And you know, we're tending to make sure all of the computations happen. We've pushed the boundaries out. This is tremendously advanced, both from us and others in the last 30 years, as you know, and has driven a lot of what changed in the world. Computation is now applied everywhere. It wasn't a few decades ago. It was actually quite rare to find high-powered calculations. It worked in physics, accountancy, places like that. But now we have linguistic interpretation, medical imaging, algorithmic trading. These seem commonplace now, but they weren't only a few years ago. Even things like archaeology have become computational. And there's a pattern here, which I've alluded to at the end of this. Computational biology, computational history, computational X. Virtually every subject now has a computational way of thinking about that subject. And that's a very important way forward. It's something that's moved many of these subjects forward in the last few years. So I'm going to claim one of the core human skills coming up is computational thinking. And I'm going to try and define what that is a little bit. There are various versions of that term going around. But the real question I want to ask is, where in our school education, and indeed even in college, is computational thinking manifested in a core sense? Where is it? The closest you think it should be in a mainstream subject is math. Sorry about the S on the end, that's because I'm British. You see, there's a math education crisis around the world. It's not just in the US, it's everywhere. Are we achieving data literacy from math? Are we promoting logical thought? Are we optimizing economic results and jobs? Are we informing democracy? Are we developing computational thinking in math or indeed anywhere else? So my argument is math education as a subject. I'm not worrying too much for a moment about the pedagogy, about how it's taught. I'm worrying about the subject. What it is 80% wrong. We spend years teaching people a subject that is not the subject they need, and certainly not going forward. And it won't surprise you to hear that the key difference, in my view, are computers. And I can summarize it this way. In real-world maths or computation, computers do almost all the calculating. In educational math, people do almost all the calculating, our students. That's the problem. And however well you teach that, wrong subject. It's not going to make it the right subject. That bifurcation is at the heart of the crisis of maths around the world. Let's just walk through what we do when we do math. Many of you have learned math for many years, but may not really have conceptualized this. Even I hadn't really before I thought about this. See, when you do math, you're really doing a four-step process. You're defining questions, you're abstracting, very powerful. You're taking it to this language, this abstract language, allows you to solve many different problems with one way of computing them. Then there's this magic step of 3. You're computing the answer. You're going from the question to the answer in an abstract form. And then 4 is you get the answer in abstract form, x equals 3, and you're interpreting what that means and checking whether it makes sense. Now, here's what's gone wrong. In education, we're spending almost all our time doing step 3 by hand. What we ought to be doing is using computers for step 3. By the way, the hint is in the name, computer. It does computing, and compute is step 3, right? So there's the hint. We should be using computers almost all the time for step 3, and we should be spending much more time with our humans, with our students, doing steps 1, 2, and 4, harder problems, more realistic problems, and so forth. See, maths, what is the point of maths and computational thinking? What's the point of all of this? It's problem solving. We're trying to get better answers to questions, decisions. And this, in a sense, the process. You go around these 4 steps many times until you get a sufficiently good answer to those questions. Now, here's a simple thing you probably had to do in school. Solve 2 linear simultaneous equations. And you can solve that in our software Mathematica, for example, and get an answer like that. Pretty straightforward. The problem is if you put a cube in there, if you change one thing there, which you might get out of some thing, it gets much more complicated. And most students can't do that. It gets even worse. Here I am talking to my phone.
Solve x cubed plus 2 equals 2y, and y minus x equals 5.
There's Siri's answer.
The answer is x2.33075y7.30,
etc. The point I'm making is if I can talk to my phone in 15 seconds and get an answer that most students can't do after 10 years of study, why the hell are we teaching them that and not something different? Now, another thing is real math needs real context. That's not, abstraction is an important part of math, but don't start with the abstract. Start with a real problem that students might want to solve. What's the perfect password for your login? Problem of every 7-year-old. Don't want my mates to break into to my computer. Am I normal? Can math help me with figuring that out? How do I design controls for my game? Things like, are girls better at math, for example? Good question. What's a beautiful shape? The Athenians worried about that problem. That's a math problem too. See, these are fuzzy problems. That's what we get in the world, real contextual problems, and the question is how we turn those into math. Key point, if you remove the computer from math education, you will remove most of the context. Most governments completely fail to understand this. That means there isn't a real biology question or a data science question or many other kinds of questions you can ask in math without computers. They didn't exist. Similarly, you learn the wrong computational tool set. If you learn how to fit 5 data points, it's a totally different set of tools that you use from 1,000,000 data points. It's a different subject. So that's another problem with removing the computer. Now, what about coding? Is coding the answer to this? I'm really pleased coding started being introduced back in schools, but I think it's slightly off in a direction of step 2 in my 4-step process. It's writing down that step 2. We need a broader computational thinking subject that combines both the coding and the math. So what I set my team to do some years ago was, could we imagine a computational curriculum assuming computers exist? Seems fairly obvious, right? You'd think somebody had done this before, but we couldn't find anybody, not around the whole world, that started from a blank screen and tried to figure out what the curriculum was. So we did this, and we called it computerbasedmath.org, and you can see the starts of it on that site. One of the things this requires is figuring out what the right outcomes are. What is it that we actually want out of our education? And how do we assess that so we don't drive everybody to the wrong learning, because assessment, as we know, unfortunately, around the world, drives almost all of what people do. And so, again, you can see some of these required outcomes that we've worked out. Things like confidence. Confidence to tackle new problems, crucial outcome. You don't have confidence to tackle a new problem, it's not a lot of use to you. You're going to be doing old problems. You didn't want to solve those. When we first launched Mathematica, Steve Jobs actually came up with the name Mathematica. But he also came up with this quote. I thought it was fascinating to look at it again. Mathematica will revolutionize the teaching and learning of math by focusing on the prose of mathematics without getting lost in the grammar. Very Jobsian sort of clarity of thought. I've highlighted Will. He was so right, and yet he's so wrong so far, because it hasn't happened yet. It's happened in the outside world, didn't happen yet in education. I've been talking mostly about school, but let's understand we have a huge workforce out there. It's never too late. And one of the things we've been focusing on recently is post-school computational thinking learning. And we launched computationalthinking.org to help with that. So if any of your organizations need to think about that, and I encourage you, it's never too late. So look, my big message here really is this. We are in an era where we have a new wave of automation. Previous waves of automation dealt less with what was quintessentially human. Agriculture, machinery. Now we've got one that hits at what people think of as being quintessentially human, intelligence. And the question we have in education is, do we try and replicate what the machine is doing, or do we try and stand on it and go further? The latter, history shows us, and intelligence shows us that the latter is what we need to do. Stand on what we've got, machinery-wise, and go further. So work a level up from the machines, don't compete with them and lose. So my question for you is, are you prepared for what I call a computational knowledge economy, where computational thinking is at the center of both survival and value-added skills? Thank you very much.
So I think it's a cruel joke when Rob decided on who was going to moderate the questions of this, that he chose the Asian involved to moderate a conversation with someone on whether we should change how we do math. So one thing Conrad doesn't know is we've got about 20 students from the Illinois Math and Science Academy who are sitting in the audience today who are probably very, very intrigued by this concept that we might be changing. You are proposing that we change how we teach math. So I think it's really fascinating. You're certainly not, so I spent the weekend listening to your YouTube tapes, trying to get my head around this. And realizing that what you're proposing is to totally overhaul how we teach arithmetic and math in school. You're certainly not proposing that we have more people that don't know how to make change when we go to Starbucks and decide to pay cash, right? I mean, you're not proposing not teaching arithmetic, are you?
Well, I think you've got to ask a question of any piece of math, including arithmetic,
yeah.
Which is, do I really want to use it in my everyday life? And does it conceptually empower me to do that by hand? And if the answer to either of those is honestly yes, it's fair to learn it. Now, I would say that basic arithmetic is probably still in that category of it's quite useful. I do multiplications in my head to check what people say to me. Mostly I estimate them. The reality of what's really important, though, is setting up the problem. If I know it's, let's say, a multiplication problem, in the end, I can pull my phone out and multiply it. So yeah, it's good to know how to multiply. It's useful because it's convenient. But actually, the setup is much more important. And what goes wrong is when you get to things like long division. I don't know when you guys last did long division. I have a math degree from Cambridge in England, and I don't really know the formal process of long division. It hasn't really impacted me. You know, that sort of thing, it's like you never use it. It doesn't really empower you. Why are we doing it? So there's a cutoff, and you need to ask that question at every point. But I'm not saying no hand calculating. I'm saying apply that cutoff honestly.
Got it. You certainly need to know enough to know that if something is off, right? I mean, you say you estimate. So you certainly need to know enough to know there's something off by a decimal point.
Yeah, but I don't think people know. The big difference is people aren't learning those skills. What they're learning is applying, adding fractions. I've never added a half and a third, really, in my real life. It doesn't happen that much. But estimating magnitudes, that's critical. Other ways to verify things, we don't teach most of that. And again, people think that the way to verify something is you do it by hand. Well, sometimes, but if you're building a bridge as an engineer, you can't do that. It's too complicated. There's no way to do it by hand. So you've got to have different ways to verify, estimation being one of those. And it's crucial we spend more time on those different ways.
That's great. So I'm sure you've proposed this to a lot of educators. What is the greatest challenge? What is it you're running up against that's making this type of change so very difficult?
So on an individual level, confusion. Most people have never really thought about this, including technical people. And they haven't really thought the subject might be wrong. They keep talking about fix the education of it, the pedagogy. And so I think most people, when you really calmly explain this and they think about it several times over, they start to realize, maybe actually there is a fundamental problem. It's so ingrained in us that math is what you need to learn, that's a difficulty. I think on a system level, we have a problem which I describe as the ecosystem of education being stuck. It's kind of like assessments lock the subject down. And not only per country, but there is international organizations like PISA and TIMSS and things that try and lock countries together. So then you can't change anything without changing for the subject, without changing the assessment. But you can't change the assessment because everybody admitted to college or whatever needs that assessment. So it all goes around the circle. And in the end, the teachers can't innovate, the schools can't innovate because they're locked by these things. So I think we've got a major challenge around the world in unlocking the ecosystem of education on the subject. And I think in the 70s, for example, this happened quite a lot with startups. And governments changed the rules, changed how things operate. And I think there's a similar kind of set of rule changes and ways we think about things that could unlock this too. Interesting.
We have a lot of business leaders here in the audience. What role do you think business has in helping create this kind of change and changing the ecosystem?
Oh, tremendous. I mean, in the end, what's driving most of this is what is perceived to be jobs. And it's a misperception, as I've tried to describe, the connection between school math and real math. And so we've got to make clear what it is we really want as business leaders. And it's not always clear, because it's complicated to figure out. And one of the things we're trying to do is lead that charge by giving us clear message on what's needed. Practically, I think, introduce computational thinking as part of your training programs. I think we have a program of building modules, for example, both for in-training and also for communities. Sponsor a module in your industry so that we can build something out that's, let's say it's about energy we were just hearing about. There are fantastic computational thinking things you can do around energy or whichever industry. So I think those are some of the ways that you can do this. And remember, it's not just for technical people. You'll have data scientists and things in your organization. It's wonderful. They already know some computational thinking. It's the managers of the future who need to know how to ask the right questions. And they need to have this sort of computational thinking. Is it cause or correlation? Is a fraud occurring? How might I ask people about that? How might I ask the right questions? How might I understand whether machine learning or statistics is the right way to approach this? It's those things, as well as calculating the things on the ground, that's important.
Computational thinking, a term that we don't hear very often in the business world, and something that we will likely hear much more of. The idea of unlocking the ecosystem that is causing this continuous loop of how we educate, how we test, how we admit, how we hire, that's got to be a huge challenge. Coming to Twin, one of the greatest things we get, the benefits, is having someone like this really perturb our thinking. I want to thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much. It's been great to be here. Thank you.